On the morning of July 14, 1966, neighbors on East 100th Street in Chicago heard screaming. Looking up, they saw a young woman on a second-floor window ledge, her hands bound, crying out in terror. "Help me! Everyone is dead. My friends are all dead." Inside the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street, police discovered 8 young women, student nurses, brutally murdered. They had been systematically tortured, raped, and killed over several hours. The lone survivor, Corazon Amurao, had hidden under a bed for more than 4 hours, listening to her friends being murdered one by one. The killer was Richard Speck, a drifter with a long criminal history and a distinctive tattoo on his left forearm that read "Born to Raise Hell." That tattoo would be his downfall. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois, the 7th of 8 children. His early childhood was difficult but unremarkable until 1947, when his father died of a heart attack. Richard was 6 years old, and the loss marked the beginning of his transformation from troubled child to violent predator. His mother, Mary Margaret, struggled to raise 8 children alone. In 1950, she remarried Carl Lindbergh, a traveling insurance salesman. The remarriage brought financial stability but introduced a toxic element into Richard's life. Lindbergh was an alcoholic who became violent when drunk, and he singled out Richard for particularly harsh treatment: physical beatings, verbal abuse, constant humiliation. Richard's response was to withdraw and act out. He began drinking heavily by age 12. He got into fights, vandalized property, stole, and skipped school. His grades were terrible, and he showed no interest in anything except causing trouble. Teachers noted his inability to control his temper and his particular hostility toward female authority figures. At 13, Richard suffered a severe head injury when he fell from a tree, requiring hospitalization. Some later evaluations suggested this injury may have caused brain damage affecting impulse control, though many experts noted his violent behavior predated the injury. By his mid-teens, Richard had developed profound misogyny. He blamed his mother for bringing Lindbergh into their lives. He blamed women generally for his failures and disappointments. His relationship with females was characterized by crude aggression and barely concealed rage. He dropped out of school in 10th grade, functionally illiterate. He drifted through menial jobs, warehouse work, shipping, loading docks, unable to hold any position for long because of drinking, fighting, or simply not showing up. In 1962, at age 21, Speck married 15-year-old Shirley Malone after she became pregnant. The marriage was a disaster. Speck was violently abusive, beating Shirley regularly, threatening to kill her, spending what little money he earned on alcohol rather than supporting his wife and daughter. Shirley lived in fear for nearly 3 years before filing for divorce in January 1966. For Speck, the divorce was another rejection that fueled his rage against all women. His already profound misogyny deepened into something even darker, a hatred that would eventually manifest in mass murder. After the divorce, Speck's life spiraled further downward. He drifted from Texas to Illinois to Michigan and back, taking temporary jobs, getting fired, accumulating arrests for burglary, theft, forgery, assault, and public intoxication. Between 1963 and 1966, he was arrested at least 40 times. Most charges were minor, resulting in short jail sentences or fines. But there were also arrests for assault, particularly assaults on women that revealed a pattern of violence that should have marked him as dangerous. The criminal justice system of 1966 was not equipped to identify or manage predators like Speck before they escalated to murder. In the spring of 1966, Speck moved to Chicago, where his sister lived. He hoped to find work on Great Lakes merchant ships, but his criminal record and reputation for unreliability made employers reluctant to hire him. By early July, He was living in a seedy boarding house on the south side, drinking constantly, looking for work, and descending into rage and desperation. On July 13, 1966, Speck went to the hearing hall hoping to be selected for a ship leaving that evening. He needed work desperately. He was behind on rent and nearly broke. But once again, he was passed over for younger, more reliable men. According to later testimony, Speck became visibly agitated when rejected. He spent the afternoon and evening drinking heavily, first at a bar, then at his boarding house. He was heard muttering threats and obscenities. The combination of alcohol, rejection, and his long-simmering hatred of women was building toward explosion. Around 9 p.m., Speck left his boarding house carrying a knife and a gun. He walked through the warm July night looking for victims. The townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street housed student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital. Speck had walked past it several times in recent weeks, noting the lack of security, the single entrance, the young women coming and going at all hours. On the night of July 13, 1966, that townhouse became the site of one of the most brutal crimes in American history. 8 young women were inside, dedicated nursing students with their whole lives ahead of them, planning their futures, studying for exams, talking about their dreams. They had no idea that a predator was approaching their door. They had no idea that before morning, 7 of them would be dead, and one would survive only by hiding under a bed for hours, listening to her friends being murdered. Richard Speck's quarter-century of rage, violence, and hatred of women was about to culminate in an act of such brutality that it would shock the nation and mark the end of an era of innocence. Part 2. A Life of Violence. Before the night of July 13-14, 1966, Richard Speck had compiled a criminal record that revealed a clear pattern of escalating violence, particularly against women. His history should have identified him as a dangerous individual, but the criminal justice system repeatedly failed to recognize the warning signs. After his divorce in early 1966, Speck's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was drinking a quart of liquor daily, supplemented by barbiturates and amphetamines. This constant intoxication made him unpredictable and aggressive. In February 1966, Speck was arrested in Dallas for aggravated assault. He had grabbed a woman by the throat in a bar and threatened to kill her when she rejected his advances. Other patrons intervened and called police. Speck was charged but released on bail. The charges were eventually dropped when the victim, likely out of fear, failed to appear in court. In March 1966, he was arrested for burglary after breaking into a boarding house room and stealing cash and personal items. He served a few days in jail and was released. Within weeks, he was arrested for writing bad checks. Again, minimal consequences. What the system failed to recognize was that these were not isolated incidents of a troubled man making poor choices. They were escalating behaviors of a dangerous predator testing boundaries. Each arrest that resulted in minimal consequences reinforced Speck's belief that he could get away with increasingly serious crimes. During this period, Speck also committed crimes that were never solved or connected to him until years later. Investigation after the nurse murders revealed he was likely responsible for several assaults on women in Dallas, Michigan, and Illinois between 1963 and 1966. Attacks that fit his pattern but were never prosecuted due to lack of evidence or witnesses' fear. One particularly disturbing incident occurred in Monmouth, Illinois, in April 1966. A young woman reported being attacked by a tall man with a pockmarked face who grabbed her as she walked home from work. She fought back, screaming and scratching her attacker's face. He fled, and she reported the incident to police. Years later, when investigators reviewed unsolved assaults in areas where Speck had lived, the Monmouth incident stood out. The description matched Speck perfectly, and the timing placed him in the area. But the case was never definitively solved. By summer 1966, Speck's hatred of women had become the defining characteristic of his personality. Friends and acquaintances from this period later told investigators that Speck talked constantly about women in the most degrading terms. He blamed women for all his problems: his failed marriage, his inability to hold a job, his criminal record, his general failures in life. In bars and boarding houses, Speck would rant about women, describing violent sexual fantasies and expressing the belief that women needed to be taught a lesson. Most people who heard these rants dismissed them as the pathetic boasting of a drunk loser. No one took him seriously enough to report his threats to authorities. This was a critical failure of the social systems of the time. In 1966, threats of violence against women were not taken seriously unless actual violence had already occurred. Domestic violence was considered a private matter. Sexual assault was rarely reported and even more rarely prosecuted. In early July 1966, Speck was living at the Shipyard Inn, a boarding house near the hearing hall where merchant seamen gathered to find work on Great Lakes ships. But Speck's reputation preceded him. He had been blacklisted by several shipping companies for drunkenness and unreliability. When he showed up at the hearing hall, employers would check his record and hire someone else. On July 13, 1966, Speck went to the hearing hall hoping to be selected for a ship leaving that evening. He needed the work desperately. He was behind on his rent and nearly out of money. But once again, he was passed over. According to testimony from people who saw Speck that afternoon, he became visibly agitated when rejected. He started drinking heavily, first at a nearby bar and then back at his boarding house. He was heard muttering threats and obscenities. Around 9 p.m., Speck left his boarding house. He later claimed he had no specific plan or target, but evidence suggests he had been scouting potential targets for days, including the nurse's townhouse. He was carrying a knife stolen from the boarding house kitchen and a .22 caliber pistol he had obtained weeks earlier. Psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest revealed a complex and deeply disturbed personality. Speck was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, characterized by complete lack of empathy, disregard for social norms, and inability to feel guilt or remorse. But the diagnosis went deeper. Speck harbored an intense pathological hatred of women, rooted in his relationship with his mother, his violent stepfather, and his failed marriage. In his distorted thinking, women were responsible for all his suffering. His mother had abandoned him by remarrying. His wife had betrayed him by divorcing him. Women in bars and at work had rejected him, reinforcing his sense of worthlessness. This toxic combination, antisocial personality disorder combined with extreme misogyny and fueled by alcohol and drugs, created a man capable of extraordinary violence. And on the night of July 13-14, 1966, that capacity would be fully realized. The 8 young women in the townhouse that night were not random victims in Speck's mind. They were selected because they represented everything he hated: young, attractive, educated, dedicated to helping others, with bright futures ahead of them. They were everything he was not and could never be. And so he decided to destroy them. Part 3, July 13, 1966. The townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street was a modest 3-story brick building in Chicago's Jeffrey Manor neighborhood. It served as housing for student nurses working at South Chicago Community Hospital, located just a few blocks away. On the evening of July 13, 1966, 9 young women were present in the townhouse. 6 were American nursing students. 3 were exchange nurses from the Philippines. The Americans were Gloria Davy, 22, Patricia Matusek, 20, Nina Schmale, 24, Pamela Wilkening, 20, Suzanne Farris, 21, and Mary Ann Jordan, 20. The three Filipino nurses were Merlita Gargullo, 23, Valentina Pasion, 23, and Corazon Amurao, 23. On that Wednesday evening, the women were engaged in typical activities. Some had worked day shifts and were relaxing. Others were preparing for overnight shifts. They were watching television, reading, studying, talking about their plans for the future. Around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. Pamela Wilkening answered. Standing at the door was a tall, thin man with a pockmarked face. He claimed to be there to see one of the Filipino nurses about a possible nursing position. Pamela, trusting and eager to help, let him in. This was Richard Speck's entry point. He did not break in through force initially. He used a plausible story and the natural kindness of young women to gain access. Once inside, his demeanor quickly changed from polite to threatening. Speck pulled out a knife and a gun. He ordered the women to gather in one bedroom, the room Nina Schmale and Pamela Wilkening shared on the second floor. 6 women were in the house at that moment, with 3 more scheduled to arrive home from their hospital shifts within hours. Speck told the frightened women that he only wanted money, that he wouldn't hurt them if they cooperated. This was a lie designed to keep them calm and compliant while he secured control. Using strips of bedsheet that he ordered the women to tear, Speck bound the hands of each woman. He moved efficiently, demonstrating planning that contradicted his later claims of acting impulsively. He had thought about this, prepared for it mentally, and was now executing a plan. The women, terrified but hoping cooperation would lead to survival, did as they were told. They believed, or wanted to believe, that if they did not resist, he would take whatever money they had and leave. Around 10:30 p.m., Suzanne Farris arrived home from her shift. She entered through the back door and came upstairs to find Speck holding the other women at gunpoint. Before she could react, Speck grabbed her and forced her into the bedroom with the others. She too was bound with strips of sheet. At approximately 11 p.m., Mary Ann Jordan arrived home. The same scenario played out. She was captured, brought upstairs, and bound. Now 8 women were captive. The last to arrive was Corazon Amurao, who came home around 11:30 p.m. She entered through the back door and heard muffled sounds from upstairs. As she climbed the stairs, Speck appeared and grabbed her. Like the others, she was brought to the bedroom and bound. 9 women were now captive. They sat or lay on the floor of the bedroom, hands tied, terrified. Speck moved around them, checking their bonds, counting them, planning his next moves. He went through their belongings, taking small amounts of cash, perhaps $50 or $60 total, but it was clear money was not his primary motivation. Several women tried to appeal to Speck's humanity. Gloria Davy spoke to him calmly, telling him he could take whatever he wanted and they wouldn't report him. Nina Schmale offered him more money if he would just leave. Pamela Wilkening simply cried and begged him not to hurt them. Speck's responses were cold and dismissive. He told them to be quiet. He warned them that if they screamed or tried to escape, he would kill them all. He prowled around the room, drinking from a bottle he had found, his behavior becoming more agitated. Around midnight, Speck's true intentions became horrifyingly clear. He selected his first victim, Pamela Wilkening, and led her out of the room. The other women heard sounds of struggle from another bedroom, then silence. Speck returned alone about 15 minutes later. He then selected Gloria Davy and led her out. Again, sounds of struggle, then silence. When Speck returned, the remaining women knew with absolute certainty that their friends were not coming back, that cooperation would not save them, that they were all going to die. What the women did not know was that Speck had lost count. He thought he had captured 8 women. In the chaos of multiple arrivals and dim lighting, he had miscounted. There were actually 9 women in the house. When Speck had finished checking the bonds of the women in the bedroom, Corazon Amurao saw an opportunity. In the shadows beneath one of the bunk beds, there was just enough space for a small person to fit. Corazon, barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds, silently rolled herself under the bed and pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. Speck did not notice. When he returned after leading Pamela out of the room, he looked at the remaining women on the floor and thought he still had 6 or 7 to deal with. He did not realize that one had hidden. This mistake, this simple error of counting, would be Speck's undoing. Because Corazon Amurao, silent and terrified beneath that bed, would survive the night, and her survival would lead directly to Richard Speck's capture and conviction. But that was hours away. For now, the night of horror was only beginning, and 7 more women would die before Speck left that townhouse in the early morning hours of July 14, 1966. Part 4: The Night of Horror. What happened over the next several hours was systematic torture and murder. The details are horrific, and while this account will not sensationalize the violence, it is necessary to understand the brutality to grasp the full magnitude of Speck's crimes. After leading Pamela Wilkening out of the bedroom, Speck took her to another room where he sexually assaulted and strangled her. He then stabbed her multiple times to ensure she was dead. He left her body on the floor and returned to select his next victim. Gloria Davy was next. She had tried most directly to reason with Speck. He led her to a different room where he raped her, strangled her, and stabbed her repeatedly. Her body suggested she had fought desperately for her life. Speck then selected Suzanne Farris. The pattern was repeated: sexual assault, strangulation, stabbing. By now, the women remaining in the bedroom knew exactly what was happening. They could hear the sounds of struggle. They knew they were waiting to die. Schmale was next. She was one of the oldest and had tried to keep the other women calm throughout the ordeal. When Speck selected her, she went quietly. Perhaps hopping resistance would only make her death more painful. She was strangled and stabbed like the others. Merlita Gargullo was the first of the Filipino exchange nurses to be taken. She spoke limited English and may not have fully understood Speck's commands throughout the night. She was strangled and stabbed, her body left in yet another room. Valentina Pasion was next. Like Merlita, she had come to America seeking opportunity and advancement. She was murdered in the same brutal fashion, sexually assaulted, strangled, and stabbed multiple times. Mary Ann Jordan, who had arrived home earlier expecting a quiet night before her next shift, was the 7th victim. She was strangled and stabbed. Her life ended in violence that served no purpose beyond satisfying Speck's rage. Patricia Matusek, the youngest at just 20 years old, was the 8th and final murder victim. Speck saved her for last, perhaps because her youth and terror satisfied his sadistic nature. She was brutally assaulted and killed like the others. By approximately 3:30 a.m. on July 14, 1966, 8 young women lay dead throughout the townhouse. Speck, exhausted by his hours of violence, gathered some items, washed himself in the bathroom, and left through the back door. He walked away believing he had left no witnesses. What Speck did not know was that beneath the bunk bed, Corazon Amurao remained hidden. She had stayed utterly still and silent for more than 4 hours, listening to the sounds of her friends being murdered one by one, terrified that at any moment Speck would realize he had miscounted. Corazon heard Speck's footsteps walking through the house one final time. She heard water running as he washed blood from his hands. She heard the back door open and close, and still she waited, not trusting that he was truly gone. She stayed under that bed until she saw daylight through the bedroom window. Only when she was certain several hours had passed did she finally crawl out. Her hands were still bound. She was in shock, barely able to process what had happened. Corazon made her way to the window facing East 100th Street. She worked herself up onto the ledge, her bound hands making the task nearly impossible. and then she began screaming, "Help me! Help me! Everyone is dead! Everyone is dead!" It was approximately 6 a.m. on Thursday, July 14, 1966. The neighbors who heard Corazon's screams would never forget them, the raw terror and grief in her voice. Within minutes, police arrived at the scene. What they found inside would haunt even the most experienced homicide detectives for the rest of their careers. 8 young women, their whole lives ahead of them, brutally murdered and left scattered throughout the house. Corazon Amurao was taken to the hospital, treated for shock and minor injuries. Despite her trauma, she was able to give police a detailed description of the killer. A tall white man, approximately 6 feet tall, slender, with a pockmarked face and greasy dark hair. Most importantly, she had seen something that would become the key to identifying Richard Speck. On his left forearm, he had a tattoo that read "Born to Raise Hell." The hunt for the killer of 8 student nurses had begun. Part 5. One Survivor. The story of Corazon Amurao's survival is one of the most remarkable aspects of the nurse murders. Her courage, her quick thinking, and her later testimony would prove essential to bringing Richard Speck to justice. After being rescued from the townhouse, Corazon was taken to South Chicago Community Hospital, the same hospital where she and her murdered friends had worked. The irony was not lost on her or on the hospital staff, who now had to care for one of their own. Corazon was in severe psychological shock. She had spent more than 4 hours hiding under a bed, listening to her friends being murdered one by one, knowing that at any moment the killer might realize he had miscounted. The trauma was almost beyond comprehension. While doctors tended to Corazon, police investigators were desperate to interview her. She was the only witness to the crime. Everything they would learn about the killer would come from her observations. Detective Daniel Kelly was assigned to interview Corazon. He approached her with sensitivity and patience, recognizing she had survived something that would have destroyed most people. Over several hours on July 14, Corazon provided a detailed account of everything she had witnessed. She described how the killer had knocked on the door and gained entry by claiming to need help with a nursing position. She described how he had produced weapons and ordered the women to gather in one bedroom. She described how he had systematically bound each woman. She described how 3 more women had arrived home and been captured. She described how the killer had led the women out of the room one by one. She described hiding under the bed and waiting for hours after he left. And she described the killer himself in remarkable detail. Despite her terror, Corazon had observed him carefully. She described his height, build, pockmarked face, greasy dark hair, clothing, and mannerisms. And she described the tattoo on his left forearm, "Born to Raise Hell." Detective Kelly realized immediately that this detail would be crucial. Tattoos with text were much less common in 1966. A tall, slender man with a pockmarked face and a "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo would be relatively easy to identify. Working with police sketch artists, Corazon helped create a composite drawing of the killer. The sketch was remarkably accurate. When later shown to Richard Speck's acquaintances, many identified him immediately. Over following days and weeks, Corazon participated in dozens of interviews, refining details, answering questions, trying to help police understand exactly what had happened. The psychological toll was enormous. Corazon had survivor's guilt, the devastating question of why she had lived when 8 of her friends had died. She replayed the night over and over, wondering if there was something she could have done differently. Mental health professionals worked with Corazon to help her understand that her survival was not something to feel guilty about, that hiding had been a brave and intelligent response, that there was nothing she could have done to save the others. But these rational explanations did little to ease the emotional burden. She had nightmares every night. She could not sleep without medication. She was afraid to be alone. She struggled with panic attacks. Despite her trauma, Corazon showed extraordinary courage in her determination to help catch the killer. She knew her testimony was essential to justice. She knew the families of her murdered friends needed answers, and she was determined that the man who had destroyed so many lives would not escape punishment. On July 16, 1966, just 2 days after the murders, Corazon's composite sketch and description were released to the media. The sketch appeared on the front page of every Chicago newspaper and was broadcast on television news. Police asked anyone who recognized the man to contact them. The tattoo detail was emphasized in all reports. Police knew "Born to Raise Hell" was distinctive enough that people who knew the killer would likely remember it. Within hours of the sketch being published, police began receiving tips. Several people called to say the sketch looked like a drifter named Richard Speck, who had been living in the area and who had a tattoo matching the description. The tips were consistent enough that Speck quickly became the primary suspect. But by the time police went to arrest him, Speck had disappeared. He had seen the sketch in newspapers or heard about the manhunt on television. He knew police were looking for him, and he had gone on the run. For Corazon, knowing the killer was still free was terrifying. She remained under police protection, afraid Speck might somehow find out she had survived and come back to finish what he started. The public was also terrified. The brutal murder of 8 student nurses had shocked Chicago and the nation. Women were afraid to be alone. Parents were calling daughters who lived in the city, begging them to come home. The idea that a killer could enter a house and systematically murder nearly everyone inside challenged assumptions about safety. Political pressure mounted on Chicago police to find the killer quickly. The investigation became the highest priority, with dozens of detectives working around the clock to locate Richard Speck. Meanwhile, Speck was hiding in plain sight, moving from one cheap hotel to another, drinking heavily, and apparently contemplating suicide. On July 16, he checked into the Star Hotel on West Madison Street under a false name. He spent the next several days in his room, drinking and watching television coverage of the manhunt. On July 17, in what may have been a suicide attempt or an accident caused by heavy drinking and drug use, Speck slashed his wrists and arms in his hotel room. He was bleeding heavily when other residents noticed blood seeping from under his door and called for help. Speck was taken to Cook County Hospital for treatment, and there, despite using a false name, he was recognized. A doctor noticed the "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo on his left forearm. The doctor had seen the news reports. He immediately contacted police. Within minutes, the hospital was surrounded. Richard Speck, barely conscious from blood loss and alcohol, was arrested in his hospital bed. The manhunt was over. For Corazon Amurao, the news brought both relief and renewed terror. Relief that the killer was caught. Terror at the realization she would have to face him again, identify him, testify against him, relive the worst night of her life in front of him in a courtroom. But Corazon's courage did not fail. When detectives asked if she could identify her attacker, she agreed immediately. On July 18, 1966, she was brought to the hospital where Speck was being held. She was shown Speck through a window, his wrists bandaged, his face pale from blood loss. Corazon looked at him for a long moment. Then she said clearly and without hesitation, "That is the man." Those 5 words sealed Richard Speck's fate. The man who had murdered 8 young women was identified by the 9th, the one who had survived through courage and luck. Justice would now be served, and Corazon Amurao's testimony would be the foundation of that justice. Part 6. The Discovery. The morning of July 14, 1966, began as a normal summer Thursday in Chicago's South Side. Residents of East 100th Street were starting their day. unaware that in the townhouse at number 2319, a scene of unimaginable horror awaited discovery. Around 6 a.m., neighbors heard screaming. Looking up, they saw a young woman on a second-floor window ledge, her hands apparently bound, crying out, "Help me! Help me! Everyone is dead! Everyone is dead!" Several neighbors called police. Others ran toward the townhouse. Within minutes, the first police officers arrived. Officer Daniel Kelly found Corazon Amurao being helped down from the window ledge by neighbors. Her hands were still loosely bound, her clothes disheveled, and she was in obvious shock. "What happened?" Kelly asked. "He killed them," Corazon said, her voice barely audible. "He killed them all, 8. They're all dead." Kelly radioed for backup and an ambulance, then asked if the killer was still in the house. She said she didn't think so, that she had heard him leave hours earlier but had been too afraid to come out of hiding. Kelly drew his weapon and entered the townhouse. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first body he encountered was in a bedroom on the second floor. One of the student nurses, stabbed multiple times, lying in a pool of blood. Kelly quickly checked for a pulse, found none, and moved to clear the rest of the house. In another bedroom, he found 2 more bodies. On the third floor, more bodies. In total, Kelly found 8 young women dead throughout the townhouse, each showing signs of brutal violence. Kelly radioed for homicide detectives, the coroner, and more officers. Within 30 minutes, the townhouse was swarming with police, detectives, and medical personnel. The magnitude of the crime was immediately apparent. This was mass murder, potentially the worst in Chicago's history. Homicide Detective Lieutenant Emil Gies was assigned as lead investigator. A veteran with decades of experience, Gies had investigated hundreds of murders, but nothing had prepared him for this. "It was carnage," Gies later told reporters. "These were young women, nurses, dedicated to helping people, and someone had systematically murdered them. The brutality was almost beyond comprehension." As detectives and crime scene technicians processed the scene, the scope of what had occurred became clearer. The killer had gained entry through the front door, possibly by deception. He had held the women at knife and gunpoint, binding them with strips of bedsheet. He had then taken them one by one to different rooms where he had sexually assaulted, strangled, and stabbed them. The forensic evidence suggested the murders had taken place over several hours, probably between midnight and 4 a.m. The killer had moved methodically, murdering the women in a systematic manner that suggested planning and control rather than frenzied rage. Perhaps most chilling was evidence that the women had known what was happening. The bedroom where they had been held showed signs they had been bound and left there while the killer took their roommates away one by one. They had waited, knowing they were going to die. The only good news was that one young woman had survived. Corazon Amurao, despite being severely traumatized, was physically unharmed and able to provide crucial information about the killer. While investigators processed the crime scene, news of the murders was spreading rapidly throughout Chicago. Initial reports were confused. Some outlets reported 6 deaths, others 10. But by mid-morning, the facts were clear. 8 student nurses had been murdered in their home in a mass killing that appeared to be sexually motivated. The public reaction was immediate and intense. These were not gang members or criminals. These were innocent young women, dedicated to healing, murdered in their own home in what should have been a safe neighborhood. Parents throughout Chicago and around the nation called their daughters, especially those in nursing programs. Many demanded their daughters quit school and return home. Some nursing programs saw enrollment drop in following months as young women decided the profession was too dangerous. At South Chicago Community Hospital, the nursing staff was in shock and grief. 8 of their colleagues, friends, roommates, young women they had worked alongside, were dead. The hospital arranged for counseling services and gave staff time off to grieve. The families of the victims were being notified throughout the day. Police officers were dispatched to homes across Chicago and neighboring states to deliver the devastating news in person. Gloria Davy's family in Indiana was informed that their daughter, who had just accepted a position as a United Airlines stewardess, was dead, murdered in her own home. Patricia Matusek's parents in Chicago learned that their youngest daughter, just 20 years old, had been killed. Pamela Wilkening's fiancé was informed that the woman he was supposed to marry in a few months was gone. The families of the 3 Filipino nurses faced additional complications. Merlita and Valentina's families were in the Philippines, where notification had to be made through the U.S. Embassy. The time difference meant families in Manila were woken in the middle of the night with news that their daughters, who had gone to America seeking opportunity, had been murdered. For Corazon's family, initial reports said all the Filipino nurses had been killed. It took several hours before they learned Corazon had survived and was physically unharmed, though severely traumatized. As the day progressed, the crime scene investigation continued. Detectives found the strips of bedsheet used to bind the victims. They found the knife, a kitchen knife from the townhouse itself. They found evidence of sexual assault. They found fingerprints on doors, windows, and furniture. By late afternoon, the coroner had arrived and begun removing the bodies. Each victim was photographed where she had been found, then carefully moved to the morgue for autopsy. The autopsies would confirm what was already apparent. All 8 women had been murdered through a combination of strangulation and stabbing, with several also showing signs of sexual assault. Detective Geese and his team worked late into the night, processing evidence, interviewing Corazon Amurao multiple times, canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses. The pressure to solve the case quickly was intense. The public was terrified. The media demanded answers. And everyone wanted the killer caught. By the end of July 14, detectives had a detailed description from Corazon Amurao, and a composite sketch was being prepared. They had fingerprints and physical evidence from the crime scene. They had a timeline of events. They knew the killer had gained entry through deception, held the women for hours, and left sometime between 3 and 5 a.m. What they didn't yet have was a name, but that would change within 48 hours, thanks to Corazon's remarkable memory and a distinctive tattoo that would prove to be Richard Speck's downfall. Part 7. The Manhunt. The publication of the composite sketch on July 16, 1966, transformed the investigation from a search for an unknown killer into a manhunt for a specific individual. The sketch, based on Corazon Amurao's description, showed a tall, thin man with a pockmarked face and dark hair. But it was the tattoo detail, born to raise hell on the left forearm, that made the difference. Within hours of the sketch being published in Chicago newspapers and broadcast on television, tips began flooding in. Several callers identified the man as Richard Speck, a drifter who had been living in the area and who was known to have a distinctive tattoo matching the description. The tips came from multiple sources: landlords at boarding houses where Speck had stayed, workers at the hearing hall, bartenders who had served him, and even his own sister Martha, who reluctantly confirmed the sketch looked like her brother and that he had a "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo. Detective Geese and his team quickly compiled a file on Richard Speck. What they learned painted a picture of a violent, unstable individual with a lengthy criminal record and a pattern of crimes against women. Born in 1941, Speck was 24 years old at the time of the murders. He had a record of arrests for burglary, theft, assault, and other crimes dating back to his teenage years. He had been married briefly but divorced after repeated domestic violence. He was an alcoholic and drug user who drifted from job to job and city to city. Most significantly, Speck had been in Chicago to seek work on Great Lakes merchant ships, and he had been rejected for a job on July 13, the same day as the murders. Witnesses reported seeing him drinking heavily and making angry statements about women throughout the evening. Detectives obtained a photograph of Speck from police records. When they showed it to Corazon Amurao, she positively identified him as the man who had murdered her friends. "That's him," she said without hesitation. "That's the man." With a positive identification from the survivor and corroborating tips from multiple witnesses, Chicago police issued a warrant for Richard Speck's arrest on July 16, 1966. His photograph was distributed to every police officer in Chicago and surrounding areas. The media publicized the photo, warning that Speck was dangerous. But Speck had seen the composite sketch in the newspapers. He knew police were looking for him, and he had gone into hiding. For the next 2 days, July 16-18, Chicago police conducted an intensive manhunt. Every flophouse, boarding house, bar, and cheap hotel on the South Side was searched. Officers checked bus terminals and train stations. Detectives interviewed Speck's known associates. The search was complicated by the fact that Speck fit a common profile: a transient white man with no permanent address, no regular employment, and no close ties. There were hundreds of men like him in the cheap hotels and boarding houses. Finding one specific individual was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Meanwhile, the public remained terrified. The knowledge that the killer of 8 nurses was still free kept the city on edge. Women were afraid to be alone. Nursing students were moving out of shared housing. The Chicago Police Department faced intense pressure to catch Speck quickly. During this time, Speck was moving from one hiding place to another, using false names and paying cash for rooms where no identification was required. He was drinking constantly, a fifth of liquor per day or more, and taking whatever pills he could buy on the street. Witnesses who saw him later reported he seemed agitated and paranoid, watching television news coverage of the manhunt. On the afternoon of July 17, Speck checked into the Star Hotel on West Madison Street using a false name. The Star was a decrepit single-room occupancy hotel where transients could rent rooms for a few dollars a night, no questions asked. He paid cash for a week, took a room on the upper floor, and barricaded himself inside. On the evening of July 17, Speck used broken glass to slash his wrists and arms while drunk in his hotel room. Whether this was a genuine suicide attempt, an accident, or a manipulative gesture remains debated. What is certain is that the wounds were serious but not immediately life-threatening. Speck bled heavily but did not sever major arteries. He may have passed out from blood loss and alcohol, or he may have changed his mind about dying. Either way, he was found hours later when other hotel residents noticed blood seeping from under his door and called for help. An ambulance was called, and Speck was taken to Cook County Hospital. He was barely conscious, suffering from blood loss and extremely intoxicated. Hospital staff began treating his wounds and gave him blood transfusions. At this point, Speck should have been just another transient who had attempted suicide, a sadly common occurrence in Chicago's cheap hotels. But fate intervened in the form of Dr. Leary Smith, a resident physician on duty. Dr. Smith was treating Speck's wounds when he noticed the tattoo on the patient's left forearm, "Born to Raise Hell." Smith had seen the news coverage. He had seen the sketch and the description of the killer's distinctive tattoo. He looked at the man on the gurney, tall, thin, pockmarked face, and realized he was treating the most wanted man in Chicago. Smith stepped out of the treatment room and immediately called the police. He then returned to continue treating Speck, giving no indication he had recognized him. Within minutes, the hospital was surrounded by police officers. Detective Geese and several other investigators rushed to the hospital. When they arrived, Speck was still being treated, heavily sedated and barely conscious. Geese approached the gurney and looked at the man lying there, the man who had brutally murdered 8 young women just 4 days earlier. "Are you Richard Speck?" Geese asked. Speck, barely conscious, mumbled a response that was not clearly yes or no. Geese looked at the left forearm and saw the tattoo, "Born to Raise Hell." There was no doubt, this was their man. Richard Speck was placed under arrest while still on the hospital gurney. He was handcuffed to the bed and placed under guard by armed police officers. The manhunt was over. News of Speck's capture spread rapidly. By midnight on July 17, the media was reporting that the killer of 8 student nurses had been apprehended. Police held a press conference in the early morning hours of July 18, announcing that Richard Benjamin Speck had been arrested and charged with the murders. Detective Geese credited the quick resolution to Corazon Amurao's detailed description and Dr. Smith's recognition of the suspect. "This man is a vicious killer who showed no mercy to his victims," Geese told reporters. "Thanks to the courage of the young woman who survived and the alertness of hospital staff, he is now in custody and will face justice." For the families of the victims, news of Speck's arrest brought mixed emotions. Relief that the killer had been caught and would not kill again. Renewed grief as they processed that this man, this nobody, this drifter with a criminal record, had stolen their daughters' lives for no reason beyond his own twisted rage. For Corazon Amurao, the news was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because the man who had murdered her friends was no longer free. Terrifying because she knew what came next. She would have to face him again, identify him in person, testify against him in court, relive the worst night of her life in front of him and the world. But Corazon did not waver. When detectives asked if she would be able to identify Speck in person, she said yes. On July 18, she was brought to Cook County Hospital under heavy police guard. She was led to a window where she could see into the room where Speck was being held, still handcuffed to his hospital bed, his wrists bandaged. Corazon looked at him for a long moment. The last time she had seen this man, he had been prowling around a bedroom selecting victims to murder. Now he looked diminished, weak, helpless, just a pathetic criminal in handcuffs. But Corazon felt no pity. She looked at Detective Geese and said clearly and firmly, "That is the man. That is the man who killed my friends." Those words sealed Richard Speck's fate. The survivor had identified her attacker. The manhunt was over. Now came the legal process that would determine whether Richard Speck would face the death penalty for what he had done. Part 8 Capture. After his arrest at Cook County Hospital on July 17, 1966, Richard Speck was held under heavy guard while he recovered from his self-inflicted wounds. He was placed in a secure hospital room with armed police officers stationed outside 24 hours a day. During his hospitalization, Speck said very little. He was heavily medicated for pain and sedation, but even when conscious, he remained largely silent. When medical staff or police officers spoke to him, he generally did not respond or gave only one-word answers. He did not ask about the charges, did not ask for a lawyer, and showed no apparent emotion. This detachment, this lack of normal emotional response to being arrested for mass murder, was characteristic of Speck's psychology. To him, being caught was simply a practical problem, not a moral catastrophe. He felt no guilt because he felt no empathy. In his mind, his victims were not real people deserving of moral consideration. They were simply objects he had used and discarded. On July 19, 1966, after his medical treatment was complete, Speck was transferred from Cook County Hospital to the Cook County Jail to await arraignment. The transfer was conducted with extraordinary security. Dozens of police officers surrounded the ambulance. The route was kept secret to prevent vigilante attack or media interference. The level of public anger toward Speck was intense. When word leaked he was being transferred, Crowds gathered outside both the hospital and the jail, chanting for his execution and holding signs demanding justice. Police had to form human barriers to keep the crowds away. Inside the jail, Speck was placed in isolation for his own protection. Other inmates, many of whom had sisters, wives, or daughters, had expressed a desire to exact their own form of justice. Jail officials took extraordinary measures to keep him safe, not out of compassion, but to ensure he survived to face trial. On July 21, 1966, Richard Speck was formally arraigned on 8 counts of murder. He was brought into court in handcuffs and shackles, flanked by armed guards. He had been assigned a public defender, Gerald Getty, who would lead his defense. The courtroom was packed with media, family members of victims, and members of the public. When Speck was led in, there was an audible gasp. This was the monster whose face had been on every front page. Speck himself showed no visible reaction. He stood silently as the charges were read, 8 counts of murder in the first degree. When asked how he pleaded, he mumbled "not guilty," in a voice so quiet the judge had to ask him to repeat himself. Bail was denied. The judge set a trial date and ordered Speck held in maximum security. The entire arraignment took less than 15 minutes. Speck was led back out, never having made eye contact with anyone, never having shown the slightest emotion. Following the arraignment, Speck's attorney Gerald Getty faced an almost impossible task, defending a client whose guilt seemed certain and whose crime was so horrific that public sentiment overwhelmingly favored execution. Getty knew Corazon Amurao could identify his client. He knew there was physical evidence linking Speck to the crime scene. He knew Speck's own actions, fleeing Chicago and attempting suicide, looked like consciousness of guilt. Getty's strategy would focus on trying to prevent the death penalty rather than achieving acquittal. He would argue for not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that Speck's long history of alcohol and drug abuse, combined with possible brain damage from his childhood head injury, had rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. To build this defense, Getty arranged for Speck to be evaluated by several psychiatrists. These evaluations provided some insight into Speck's psychology, though they ultimately did not support an insanity defense. The psychiatrists found that Speck was of average intelligence, understood right from wrong, and was capable of forming intent to commit crimes. He did not suffer from delusions or hallucinations. He did not have any mental illness that would meet the legal standard for insanity. What the psychiatrists did find was a deeply disturbed personality characterized by profound narcissism, lack of empathy, and extreme misogyny. Speck viewed women as objects existing only for his use. He felt entitled to take what he wanted, including their lives. He showed no remorse and no concern for his victims or their families. One psychiatrist noted, "Mr. Speck presents as an antisocial personality with psychopathic traits. He is capable of extreme violence without remorse. His hatred of women appears rooted in his relationship with his mother and his failed marriage, but these factors do not constitute legal insanity. He knew what he was doing on the night of July 13-14, 1966, and he knew it was wrong. He simply did not care." During interviews with psychiatrists, Speck maintained his innocence, insisting he had not killed the nurses and that someone was framing him. But his defense was half-hearted and unconvincing. When pressed for details about his whereabouts on the night of the murders, he claimed he could not remember because he had been drunk and had blacked out. This claim of blackout due to intoxication would become central to his defense strategy. Getty argued that even if Speck had committed the murders, he was so intoxicated he could not form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. Therefore, the proper charge would be manslaughter or second-degree murder at most, not capital murder. But this defense faced a significant problem. The evidence showed the murders were not committed in a drunken frenzy. They were methodical, calculated, carried out over several hours with clear planning and control. A person in a blackout state would not be capable of such systematic violence. As weeks passed and the trial date approached, more details about Speck's background emerged. Investigators uncovered his history of violence against women, including several assaults that had never been prosecuted. They documented his criminal record, his substance abuse, his history of unemployment and drifting. They also investigated whether Speck might have committed other murders before the nurse killings. There were several unsolved murders of women in areas where Speck had lived, in Texas, Michigan, Illinois. Police investigated these cases, looking for connections. While several cases seemed suggestively similar, lone women attacked at night, sexual assault, excessive violence, none could be definitively linked to him. Without confessions or physical evidence, these cases remained unsolved. But many investigators believed the 8 nurses were not Speck's first victims, only the first time he had been caught. Throughout this period, Corazon Amurao was preparing to testify. She met repeatedly with prosecutors, going over her testimony, preparing for cross-examination. She visited the courtroom where the trial would be held, sitting in the witness box to familiarize herself with the setting. The psychological preparation was intense. Corazon would have to face Richard Speck in court, look at him directly, and describe in detail what he had done. She would have to relive the worst night of her life in front of him, in front of his lawyers, in front of the media and public. And she would have to do it knowing Speck's defense team would try to discredit her testimony, to suggest she might be mistaken, to cast doubt on her credibility. But Corazon never wavered. She told prosecutors she would do whatever was necessary to ensure justice was served for her murdered friends. "They cannot speak for themselves," she said, "so I must speak for them. I must make sure their killer is punished for what he did." The prosecution team, led by State's Attorney William Martin, knew their case was strong but not guaranteed. They had a surviving eyewitness, physical evidence from the crime scene, and Speck's own behavior after the murders that suggested guilt. But they also knew defense attorneys were skilled at creating doubt, and that a jury might be swayed by claims of intoxication or mental illness. Martin decided to make the prosecution case as straightforward as possible. He would present Corazon's identification testimony, supported by physical evidence and testimony about Speck's behavior before and after the murders. He would present autopsy reports showing cause and manner of each death. He would present fingerprint evidence linking Speck to the crime scene. And he would present evidence of Speck's criminal history and pattern of violence against women. The goal was to paint a picture of a dangerous, violent man who had committed premeditated mass murder and then tried to escape justice. No claims of insanity or intoxication could change those basic facts. Richard Speck had murdered 8 young women, and he needed to pay for that crime with his life. As the trial date approached, set for April 1967, giving both sides time to prepare, public interest remained intense. The case had become a national sensation. The trial would be one of the most closely watched in American history, and at its center would be Corazon Amurao, the survivor who would have to relive her trauma to ensure justice was served. Part 9. The Trial. The trial of Richard Benjamin Speck began on April 3, 1967, in the Peoria County Courthouse in Peoria, Illinois. The venue had been moved from Chicago due to intense pretrial publicity that made it impossible to seat an impartial jury in Cook County. The Honorable Herbert C. Pasion presided. Selecting a jury proved extraordinarily difficult. The case had received massive media coverage for months. Nearly everyone in Illinois had formed an opinion about Speck's guilt. It took 3 weeks to find 12 jurors who could credibly claim they could be impartial. The prosecution team was led by William Martin, state's attorney for Cook County. The defense was led by public defender Gerald Getty, who faced the monumental challenge of defending a client whose guilt seemed obvious and whose crime was utterly indefensible. The courtroom was packed every day. Family members of the victims attended, seeking justice and closure. Media from around the world sent reporters. Members of the public waited in long lines for limited public seating. Richard Speck sat at the defense table throughout the trial, showing little emotion. He wore a suit provided by his attorneys, his hair was cut short, and his face was expressionless. He rarely looked at anyone, keeping his eyes downcast or staring into the distance. He never took the stand in his own defense. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by William Martin, was direct and devastating. The evidence will show that on the night of July 13, 1966, the defendant Richard Speck broke into a townhouse occupied by student nurses. Over the course of several hours, he systematically raped, tortured, and murdered 8 innocent young women. One woman survived by hiding. She will identify the defendant as the killer. The physical evidence will corroborate her testimony. The defendant's own actions after the murders, fleeing Chicago and attempting suicide, show consciousness of guilt. This is a simple case of brutal murder, and the evidence will prove beyond any doubt that Richard Speck is responsible. The defense's opening statement attempted to introduce doubt without denying the obvious. The defense does not dispute that 8 young women were murdered on July 13-14, 1966. That is a tragedy beyond words. But the question before you is whether the prosecution can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard Speck committed these murders. The defense will show that Mr. Speck was severely intoxicated on the night in question and has no memory of his actions. We will show that his identification by the witness may be mistaken. We will show that the evidence is not as clear as the prosecution claims. Your job is not to convict someone because of public pressure or media attention. Your job is to carefully consider the evidence and render a verdict based only on that evidence. It was a weak opening, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The prosecution's case began with Corazon Amurao. On April 5, 1967, she took the witness stand to testify about the night of July 13-14, 1966. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in and took her seat in the witness box. Corazon was visibly nervous but composed. Prosecutor Martin led her through her testimony methodically. She described the evening of July 13, how the killer had knocked on the door and gained entry. She described how he had pulled out weapons and forced the women into one bedroom. She described how he had bound them with strips of bedsheet. She described the arrivals of the other women and how they too had been captured and bound. Then Martin asked her to describe what happened next. Corazon's voice became quieter, more strained, as she described how Speck had begun taking the women out of the room one by one. She described the sounds she had heard, struggles, screams cut short, then silence. She described how she had hidden under the bed when Speck's attention was elsewhere. "Why did you hide under the bed?" Martin asked. "Because I knew he was killing them," Corazon said, tears streaming down her face. "I knew if he found me, he would kill me too. I wanted to live. I wanted to tell what happened." Martin then came to the crucial question. "Miss Amurao, is the man who came into your townhouse that night and murdered your friends here in this courtroom?" Corazon looked directly at Richard Speck for the first time since the trial began. Speck, who had been looking down, slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. "Yes," Corazon said firmly, pointing at Speck. "That is the man. I will never forget his face." The courtroom remained silent. Corazon's identification was clear, direct, and unwavering. She had looked her friend's killer in the eye and identified him without hesitation. Martin then asked Corazon to describe any distinguishing features she had noticed about the killer. She described his height, build, pockmarked face, and then she described the tattoo on his left forearm, "Born to Raise Hell." "Would you recognize that tattoo if you saw it again?" Martin asked. "Yes," Corazon said. Martin asked Richard Speck to stand and roll up his left sleeve. Speck's attorney objected, but the judge overruled. Speck stood slowly and with obvious reluctance rolled up his sleeve. There, clearly visible on his left forearm, was the tattoo, "Born to Raise Hell." "Is that the tattoo you saw on the night of July 13, 1966? Martin asked. "Yes," Corazon said. "That is the same tattoo." The defense attorney, Gerald Getty, now had the unenviable task of cross-examining Corazon. He approached carefully, knowing that being too aggressive could backfire with the jury. Getty's strategy was to suggest Corazon's memory might be unreliable due to trauma. He questioned whether she could be certain of her identification given poor lighting and her state of terror. He suggested that in her fear, she might have convinced herself Speck was the killer when it might have been someone else. But Corazon did not waver. She calmly but firmly insisted she had gotten a clear look at the killer's face multiple times over several hours. She noted the lighting was sufficient to see him clearly. She pointed out she had hidden under the bed specifically because she wanted to survive to identify the killer, so she had paid close attention to his features. Getty's cross-examination accomplished nothing except to allow Corazon to reaffirm her identification multiple times. When she stepped down from the witness stand after 2 days of testimony, it was clear her testimony had been devastating to the defense. The prosecution then presented physical evidence. Crime scene technicians testified about fingerprints found in the townhouse that matched Richard Speck's. Medical examiners testified about cause and manner of death for each victim, strangulation and stabbing, with evidence of sexual assault on several victims. Forensic experts testified about blood evidence found on clothing Speck had been wearing when arrested. DNA testing did not exist in 1967, but blood type analysis showed some of the blood on Speck's clothing matched the blood types of the victims. The prosecution presented evidence of Speck's behavior on July 13, including testimony from witnesses who had seen him drinking heavily and making angry statements about women. They presented evidence he had been rejected for a job that day and had been in a rage about it. They presented evidence of his flight after the murders, leaving Chicago, checking into hotels under false names, trying to hide. And they presented evidence of his suicide attempt, which prosecutors argued showed consciousness of guilt. Perhaps most damning was testimony of Dr. Leary Smith, the physician who had recognized Speck's tattoo at Cook County Hospital. Dr. Smith described treating a patient for self-inflicted wounds when he noticed the "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo and realized he was treating the man wanted for the nurse murders. "There was no doubt in my mind," Dr. Smith testified. "I had seen the news reports, I knew the description. This was the man." The defense, when it came time to present their case, had little to work with. They called psychiatrists who testified about Speck's alcohol and drug abuse and suggested he might have been in a blackout state during the murders. But under cross-examination, these psychiatrists admitted someone in a blackout state would not be capable of the methodical, planned violence that characterized the murders. The defense called character witnesses who testified Speck could be kind when sober, that he had sometimes helped people, that he had a difficult childhood. But these witnesses were not persuasive. Whatever kindness Speck might have occasionally shown did not outweigh the brutal murder of 8 innocent women. Getty, in his closing argument, made a final attempt to create doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a tragic case. 8 young women are dead. Their families deserve justice. But justice means convicting the right person based on proof, not on emotion or public pressure. The prosecution wants you to believe that identification by one traumatized witness and some circumstantial evidence is enough to send a man to his death. But is it? Can you say beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard Speck is guilty?" But William Martin's closing argument for the prosecution was far more powerful. The defense wants you to believe this is a close case, that there is doubt, but there is no doubt. Corazon Amurao looked the killer in the face for hours. She saw him clearly. She described him in perfect detail. She identified his tattoo. She identified him in person. The physical evidence corroborates her testimony. The defendant's own behavior after the murders shows guilt. He fled. He hid. He tried to kill himself rather than face justice. This is not a close case. This is as clear a case of guilt as you will ever see. 8 young women are dead because of what this man did. Justice demands that you find him guilty. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. On April 15, 1967, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all 8 counts of murder in the first degree. Richard Speck showed no visible emotion when the verdicts were read. He sat impassively as each guilty was announced, his face expressionless, his eyes distant. The sentencing phase began immediately. Under Illinois law, the same jury would decide whether Speck should receive the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecution argued for death, noting the extreme brutality of the crimes, the number of victims, and the lack of any mitigating factors. The defense argued for life, citing Speck's troubled childhood, his substance abuse, and the possibility of rehabilitation. After brief deliberation, the jury recommended death. On June 5, 1967, Judge Pasion formally sentenced Richard Speck to death in the electric chair for the murder of 8 student nurses. As he was led from the courtroom, Speck finally showed some emotion, not remorse or grief, but anger. He glared at the prosecutors and at Corazon Amurao with what witnesses described as pure hatred. Even facing execution, he felt no guilt for what he had done, only rage at being caught and punished. The trial was over. Justice had been served, at least in the legal sense. But for the families of the 8 murdered women, and for Corazon Amurao, the trauma would never truly end. Part 10: Prison and Death. Richard Speck's death sentence seemed to be the end of his story. He was sent to death row at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois to await execution. But in 1972, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Furman v. Georgia that the death penalty as then administered was unconstitutional. Speck's sentence was commuted to 8 consecutive terms of 50 to 150 years in prison, effectively 400 to 1,200 years. There was no possibility of parole. Speck would spend the rest of his life in prison. For the families of the victims, the commutation was devastating. They had endured the trial, had accepted that justice would eventually be served through Speck's execution, and now that closure was denied. Speck would live, would grow old, would have decades that their daughters would never have. But Speck would never walk free, and his life in prison would prove far from comfortable. Upon his transfer from death row to general population at Stateville, Speck became a target for other inmates. Men who had daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers did not take kindly to someone who had murdered 8 young women. Speck was attacked multiple times during his first years, suffering beatings and stabbings. Prison authorities eventually placed Speck in protective segregation. He was housed in a special unit with other inmates whose crimes made them targets, child molesters, informants, and other particularly reviled criminals. He spent most of his time in his cell, allowed out only for limited recreation and occasional work assignments. During his decades in prison, Speck showed no remorse for his crimes. He never apologized to the families of his victims. He never admitted guilt, despite his conviction. He never expressed any understanding of the pain and suffering he had caused. In occasional interviews with psychiatrists and corrections officials, Speck continued to minimize his crimes and blame others. He claimed he had been too drunk to remember the night of the murders. He suggested someone had framed him. He complained about the harshness of his sentence and the conditions of his confinement. He never once acknowledged that 8 young women were dead because of what he had done. Over the years, Speck gained significant weight and developed health problems related to his heavy smoking, poor diet, and lack of exercise. He had multiple heart attacks and required medical treatment for various ailments. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, rumors began to circulate about Speck's activities in prison. There were suggestions he had become involved in drug use and trafficking within the prison system, that he had formed relationships with other inmates, and that he was living a relatively comfortable life despite his sentence. These rumors were confirmed in 1996 when a videotape surfaced that had been secretly recorded inside Stateville Prison in 1988. The tape showed Richard Speck, visibly intoxicated or high on drugs, engaging in sexual acts with another inmate, and making crude statements about his crimes and his life in prison. Most disturbingly, in the tape, Speck made statements that seemed to show enjoyment of his notoriety. He referred to himself as famous, laughed about the murders, and showed absolutely no remorse or regret. At one point he said, "If you're asking me if I felt sorry, no. I would say there's no way, man. I just don't have those kind of feelings." The videotape caused outrage when it was released publicly in 1996. The families of Speck's victims were horrified to see that he was apparently living a relatively comfortable life in prison, with access to drugs and engaging in behaviors that suggested he was not suffering for his crimes. Prison authorities launched an investigation into how Speck had obtained drugs and how the videotape had been recorded and smuggled out. Several corrections officers were disciplined for lax security. Stricter measures were implemented to control contraband. But by the time the tape surfaced publicly, Richard Speck was already dead. On December 5, 1991, Richard Speck died of a heart attack in Silver Cross Hospital near Joliet, Illinois. He was 49 years old. He had spent 25 years in prison, far less time than his victims would have lived had he not murdered them, but the entirety of his adult life after the night of July 13-14, 1966. When news of Speck's death was announced, reactions were mixed. Some family members of victims expressed relief that he was finally gone, that they would no longer have to live with the knowledge that their daughter's killer was alive. Others expressed disappointment that he had died of natural causes rather than being executed as originally sentenced. Corazon Amurao, who had rebuilt her life after the trauma of 1966, reportedly said she felt nothing when she heard of Speck's death. "He died. My friends are still dead. Nothing changes." Speck's body was cremated and his ashes were scattered. There was no funeral, no memorial service, no marker to indicate where he was laid to rest. His family, ashamed of his crimes, wanted no public acknowledgement of his death or his existence. In death, Richard Speck faded into obscurity. While his crimes remained infamous, the man himself was largely forgotten except by those whose lives he had destroyed. He left behind no legacy except pain, no accomplishments except murder, no mark on the world except the void created by the 8 lives he had stolen. The videotape released in 1996, 5 years after his death, provided a final glimpse into the mind of a monster. It showed a man who never felt remorse, never understood the enormity of what he had done, never grasped that his actions had destroyed not just 8 lives but countless others, the families, the friends, the colleagues. The patients those 8 women would have healed had they lived. Richard Speck lived 49 years. 8 of his victims never reached 25. He died of a heart attack, relatively quickly and without prolonged suffering. His victims died in terror and agony, knowing they were being murdered, waiting for their turn to die. In the end, Richard Speck was exactly what Corazon Amurao had identified him as on that terrible night in July 1966, a monster who had destroyed 8 beautiful lives. And while legal justice was served through his conviction and imprisonment, true justice, the restoration of what he had stolen, was impossible. Richard Speck's death was the end of his story. But for the families of his victims and for Corazon Amurao, the story never ends. The grief, the loss, the trauma of July 13-14, 1966 remains with them forever. Part 11. 8 Nurses RMMBRD. The story of the nurse murders is too often told as the story of Richard Speck. But the true story belongs to the 8 young women whose lives were stolen. They deserve to be remembered not as victims but as people, as daughters, sisters, friends, colleagues, young women with dreams and potential who were dedicated to the healing profession. Gloria Davy was 22 years old when she died. Born in Dyer, Indiana, she had recently graduated from nursing school and had been working at South Chicago Community Hospital for just a few months. She was beautiful, outgoing, and ambitious. She had been accepted for a position as a flight attendant with United Airlines and was planning to leave nursing to pursue this new career. She was excited about traveling the world, meeting new people, starting a new chapter of her life. Gloria's family described her as the light of their lives. She was close to her parents and siblings, calling home frequently to share stories about her work and her plans. She had a boyfriend who was planning to propose to her. On the night of July 13, 1966, Gloria tried to reason with Richard Speck, tried to appeal to whatever humanity he might possess. When Speck took her from the room, she fought for her life with everything she had. Gloria Davy should have had decades of life ahead of her. Instead, she died at 22, murdered by a man who saw her not as a human being but as an object to be used and discarded. Patricia Matusek was 20 years old, the youngest of the 8 victims. Born and raised in Chicago, she was a nursing student who had been training at South Chicago Community Hospital. She was quiet and gentle, known for her kindness to patients and her dedication to learning her profession. Patricia came from a large, close-knit family. She was one of several children and was particularly close to her younger siblings, who looked up to her as a role model. Her family was proud that she had chosen nursing as her career and had supported her education and training. She loved children and had talked about specializing in pediatric nursing. Her instructors and colleagues described her as someone who had a natural gift for comforting frightened or sick children. Patricia had her whole life ahead of her. Instead, she died at 20, the youngest victim of a killer who showed no mercy to her youth or her innocence. Nina Jo Schmale was 24 years old, the oldest of the American nurses in the house that night. Born in Wheaton, Illinois, she had already completed her nursing training and was working as a registered nurse at South Chicago Community Hospital. She was pursuing additional certification to advance her career. Nina was the responsible one, the mature one, the one who looked out for her younger roommates. On the night of the murders, she tried to keep everyone calm, tried to reassure them that if they cooperated, they would be okay. Nina was engaged to be married to her longtime boyfriend. They were planning a wedding for the following year. She had already picked out her dress, selected bridesmaids, started making plans for her married life. Nina Schmale should have married the man she loved, should have had the children she dreamed of, should have had a long and fulfilling career in nursing. Instead, she died at 24, murdered in the home she had believed was safe. Pamela Wilkening was 20 years old and engaged to be married to her high school sweetheart. They had been together for years and were planning a wedding for later in 1966. She was excited about her future, becoming a wife, starting her nursing career, building a life with the man she loved. Pamela was the first to be taken from the room by Speck, the first to die. Her fiancé later said that knowing she was first, that she likely died not knowing what was happening or why, was a small comfort in an otherwise unbearable tragedy. Pamela was known for her sunny disposition and her optimism. She saw the best in everyone, believed in the goodness of people, never imagined that someone could be as evil as Richard Speck proved to be. When she opened the door to let Speck into the townhouse, she was trying to be helpful and kind. Her kindness cost her her life. Pamela Wilkening should have married her high school sweetheart, should have had the children they had talked about, should have grown old with the man she loved. Instead, she died at 20. Suzanne Farris was 21 years old. She had recently completed her nursing degree and was working at South Chicago Community Hospital. She was one of 3 children and was particularly close to her mother, calling her almost every day to chat about work and life. Suzanne loved nursing and had found her calling caring for elderly patients. She had a gift for making them comfortable, for listening to their stories, for treating them with the dignity and respect they deserved. Her colleagues and patients adored her. She had recently started dating a young man and was excited about the relationship. She talked about him constantly with her roommates, giddy with the new romance and the possibilities it represented. Suzanne Farris should have had a long career in nursing, should have married and had a family, should have grown old herself and been cared for by younger nurses in her final days. Instead, she died at 21. Mary Ann Jordan was 20 years old. She had recently graduated from nursing school and had just started her professional career at South Chicago Community Hospital. She was from Chicago and was close to her family, visiting them frequently on her days off. Mary Ann was known for her laugh, infectious and joyful. It could brighten even the most difficult day on the hospital ward. Her patients loved her because she brought joy and optimism to their care. Her colleagues loved her because she made even the most stressful shifts more bearable. She had dreams of traveling, of seeing the world beyond Chicago. She talked about saving money to take a trip to Europe, about wanting to see Paris and Rome, and all the places she had read about in books. Mary Ann Jordan should have traveled the world, should have had those adventures, should have lived a long and joyful life. Instead, she died at 20. The 3 Filipino exchange nurses, Merlita Gargullo, Valentina Pasion, and Corazon Amurao, had come to America seeking opportunity and advanced training. They came from modest backgrounds in the Philippines and saw nursing as a way to build better lives for themselves and their families. Merlita Gargullo was 23 years old. She had been in the United States for about a year and was thriving in her work at South Chicago Community Hospital. She sent money home to her family in the Philippines regularly and had dreams of eventually bringing her younger siblings to America for education and opportunities. Merlita was deeply religious and attended church regularly. She wrote letters home describing America, the work she was doing, the friends she had made. Her family treasured those letters and reread them constantly after her death. Merlita Gargullo should have continued her nursing career, should have helped her family, should have returned to the Philippines one day as a success story to inspire other young women. Instead, she died at 23, murdered far from home, her dreams unfulfilled. Valentina Pasion was 23 years old and had arrived in Chicago just a few months before her death. She was still adjusting to American culture, still improving her English, still finding her way in this new country. She was shy but determined, working hard to prove herself worthy of the opportunity she had been given. Valentina wrote to her family about her experiences, describing the American patients she cared for, the medical technology that was so much more advanced than what was available in the Philippines, the kindness of her American colleagues who helped her adjust. She was homesick but excited about her future. Valentina Pasion should have completed her training, should have become a skilled and experienced nurse, should have had the career she dreamed of. Instead, she died at 23, just months after arriving in the country that had promised her a better life. Corazon Amurao was also 23 years old and had been in the United States for 2 years. Unlike Merlita and Valentina, she survived the night of July 13-14, 1966. But she lost her friends and roommates, women she had lived with and worked alongside, women who had become her American family. Corazon's survival came at an enormous psychological cost. She suffered from survivor's guilt, from PTSD, from nightmares and anxiety that would persist for the rest of her life. She moved back to the Philippines after the trial, unable to remain in the country where her friends had been murdered. In the Philippines, Corazon married and had children. She continued working as a nurse for many years, dedicating herself to the profession that had brought her to America and that had defined her murdered friends' dreams. She rarely spoke publicly about the events of July 1966, preferring to let her friends be remembered rather than focus on her own survival. Corazon Amurao lived the life that her 8 friends were denied. She grew older, had a family, pursued a career, experienced all the joys and sorrows of a full life. But she carried the weight of that night with her always, the knowledge that she had lived while they had died, the memories of their screams that she could never forget. The 8 nurses, Gloria, Patricia, Nina, Pamela, Suzanne, Mary Ann, Merlita, and Valentina, were not just victims of Richard Speck's violence. They were young women with dreams, with potential, with futures that should have unfolded over decades. They were dedicated to the healing profession, committed to caring for the sick and vulnerable, training to make a difference in the world. In Chicago and around the nation, memorials were established to honor the 8 nurses. A scholarship fund was created to support nursing students. A monument was erected bearing their names. Their nursing school held annual memorial services. All of this was done to ensure that Gloria, Patricia, Nina, Pamela, Suzanne, Mary Ann, Merlita, and Valentina would be remembered not as Speck's victims, but as the remarkable young women they were. The families of the 8 nurses never fully recovered from their losses. Parents buried children. A fiancé lost the woman he loved. Siblings grew up without sisters who should have been part of their lives for decades. The grief was not just for the deaths, but for all the moments that would never happen. Weddings, births, holidays, everyday conversations that make up the fabric of family life. Some family members channeled their grief into advocacy, working to support nursing education, improve campus and hospital security, and advocate for victims' rights. Others withdrew from public life, unable to bear the constant reminders of what they had lost. But all of them insisted on one thing, that their daughters, their sisters, their loved ones be remembered as more than victims. They were Gloria, Patricia, Nina, Pamela, Suzanne, Mary Ann, Merlita, and Valentina, young women who loved and were loved, who had dreams and hopes and potential, whose lives mattered. Richard Speck tried to reduce them to nothing, to objects he could use and destroy. But he failed. Because more than 50 years after their deaths, they are still remembered. Their names are still spoken. Their dedication to nursing is still honored. And their memory serves as a reminder of the preciousness of every human life and the devastating impact of violence. Gloria Davy, Patricia Matusek, Nina Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Farris, Mary Ann Jordan, Merlita Gargullo, and Valentina Pasion. These 8 young women deserve to be remembered, honored, and mourned. They deserved far more than the 20 to 24 years they lived. They deserved to fulfill their dreams, to live full lives, to grow old surrounded by the people they loved. Richard Speck took all of that from them, but he could not take away who they were, what they represented, or the fact that they mattered. And in remembering them, in telling their stories alongside the story of their killer, we ensure that they are never forgotten. Part 12. Final Aria Felicitiones. The murders committed by Richard Speck on July 13–14, 1966, marked a turning point in American consciousness about crime, violence, and safety. The case resonated far beyond Chicago, becoming a national trauma that challenged assumptions about who was safe, where, and why. Part of what made the murders so shocking was the victims themselves. These were not people involved in criminal activity or living risky lifestyles. They were student nurses, young women from good families, pursuing a respectable profession, living in what should have been secure housing. If they were not safe in their own home, then who was safe anywhere? The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young women living independently away from their families. In 1966, more women than ever before were attending college, pursuing careers, and living away from parental protection. The nurse murders fed into societal anxieties about this social change. But the response from young women themselves was different. Many saw the murders not as a reason to retreat from independence, but as a reason to demand better security, better protection, better responses from authorities when women reported feeling unsafe. The case became, in some ways, an early catalyst for feminist demands that women's safety be taken seriously. The Speck case also exposed failures in the criminal justice system that allowed a dangerous, violent man to remain free despite numerous arrests. Speck's criminal record should have identified him as a serious threat. His pattern of violence against women should have triggered more serious intervention. This began to change in the decades following the nurse murders. Advocacy by women's groups, combined with high-profile cases like Speck's, led to reforms in how domestic violence and violence against women were policed and prosecuted. The case also raised questions about the death penalty that remain relevant today. Speck was originally sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted when the Supreme Court temporarily invalidated death penalty statutes in 1972. For the families of victims, this commutation felt like justice had been denied. But the videotape that emerged in 1996, showing Speck apparently living comfortably in prison with access to drugs and appearing to feel no remorse, reignited debates about the purpose of punishment. These questions have no easy answers. The role of Corazon Amurao in bringing Speck to justice cannot be overstated. Her survival, her courage in identifying her attacker, and her testimony at trial were essential to his conviction. Without her, Speck might never have been caught or might have been acquitted for lack of evidence. But Corazon's survival came at an enormous personal cost. She suffered from trauma that affected her for the rest of her life. She lost her friends and the life she had been building in America. She had to relive the worst night of her life in court and in interviews. Society asks a great deal of crime victims who survive to testify. We expect them to participate in investigations and trials, to relive their trauma, to face their attackers. We praise their courage, as we should. But we must also recognize the burden we place on them and provide adequate support for their healing. The legacy of the nurse murders extends to the nursing profession itself. In the immediate aftermath, enrollment in nursing programs dropped as young women and their families feared for their safety. But over time, the profession rallied, honoring the 8 murdered nurses as martyrs who had died in service to the calling of healing. Nursing schools established scholarships in the names of the victims. Professional nursing organizations created awards for exceptional student nurses that bore their names. The tragedy was transformed, as much as such a tragedy can be, into a reminder of the nobility and importance of the nursing profession. The case also had cultural impacts that extended beyond criminal justice and nursing. It became a symbol of the end of 1960s innocence, of the transition from a time when people felt relatively safe to an era of rising crime and social disorder. This cultural shift had both positive and negative consequences. On the positive side, it led to improved security measures, better lighting and locks on doors, more awareness of personal safety. On the negative side, it contributed to fear of cities, fear of strangers, and a more suspicious and less trusting society. The question of what creates a killer like Richard Speck remains relevant. Was it his troubled childhood? His abusive stepfather, his mother's abandonment through remarriage, his head injury as a teenager, his substance abuse, his failed marriage? The truth is that all of these factors likely contributed, but none fully explains the monster he became. Many people experience childhood trauma, abuse, substance addiction, and failed relationships without becoming mass murderers. What made Speck different was a combination of factors: his fundamental lack of empathy, his extreme misogyny, his narcissistic personality, and his choices to repeatedly engage in violent behavior. Understanding the factors that contribute to violent criminality is important for prevention, but it's equally important to recognize that regardless of contributing factors, individuals like Speck make choices for which they bear responsibility. Speck chose violence repeatedly throughout his life. He chose to enter that townhouse. He chose to bind those women. He chose to murder them one by one. No amount of difficult childhood experiences excuses those choices or absolves him of responsibility for them. The case raises a final question. Could the murders have been prevented? If Speck's violence against women had been taken more seriously earlier in his life, if his criminal record had triggered more serious intervention, if the red flags had been noticed and acted upon, might 8 young women still be alive? The answer is probably yes. There were numerous points at which the system could have intervened more effectively to stop Speck before he escalated to mass murder. But those interventions did not happen, largely because society in the 1960s did not take violence against women seriously enough, and because the criminal justice system was not designed to identify and manage dangerous predators before they committed their worst crimes. The lesson from this is not to engage in futile regret about what might have been, but to do better going forward, to take threats against women seriously, to intervene effectively with violent offenders before they escalate, to design systems that identify dangerous individuals and manage them in ways that protect public safety. More than 50 years have passed since the night of July 13, 1966. The 8 nurses who died that night have been gone for more than half a century. Their families have aged, with many of the parents and older siblings now deceased themselves. But the memory of what happened in that townhouse on East 100th Street remains. It remains as a tragedy that shook a nation. It remains as a reminder of the vulnerability of the innocent and the evil that some people are capable of. It remains as a testament to the courage of one woman who survived and ensured that justice was served. And most importantly, it remains as a memorial to 8 young women: Gloria, Patricia, Nina, Pamela, Suzanne, Mary Ann, Merlita, and Valentina, who dreamed of healing others and who were stolen from the world before they could fulfill